Thank you for joining us and welcome to the City Club of Central Oregon. Today's live stream is Journalism in Crisis, the impact of COVID-19 on the American media. My name is Christine Coffin, Director of Communications at OSU Cascades, and I'm honored to serve on City Club's program committee. Before we begin the program, I have a few announcements. First, I'd like to give a shout out to City Club's annual sponsors. Without their support, we would not be able to bring you today's live stream. Today's live stream is also made possible by Connect Central Oregon, a nonprofit launched with the assistance of the OSU Cascades Innovation Co-Lab. As various aspects of our community start to reopen, City Club is beginning to plan how and when we can return to in-person forums. Please know that we approach these plans with an abundance of caution and with the safety of our speakers, guests, and community always the highest priority. In the meantime, we will host virtual forums that are free to the public. We're committed to continuing conversations of consequence for our region. As we adjust to the new normal, we hope you'll continue to engage and support our efforts. If you're watching and enjoying this, please consider making a donation. If you've been toying with the idea of becoming a member, now would be a great time to sign up. And now on to today's forum. Today's facilitator has been with us before. Damian Radcliffe is a professor of practice and the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor in Journalism in the School of Journalism at the University of Oregon. An experienced digital analyst, consultant, journalist, and researcher, Damian has worked in editorial, research, policy, and teaching for the past two decades in the UK, Middle East, and USA. Damian was a panelist at our October 2019 forum on the changing landscape of our local print media. If you'd like to see that presentation, please go to our website at cityclubco.org, where you can find it and all past forum recordings. We also invite you to post questions now for our experts on Facebook or YouTube to be answered during this forum. And we invite you to post questions for local journalists, and we'll share their responses in videos after today's forum. And with that, we'll go ahead and start the forum. Damian, please take it away.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very timely and topical discussion on journalism in crisis, the impact of COVID-19 on the American media. And thank you, of course, to City Club for inviting me back to moderate this event. First, let's start with a couple of pieces of housekeeping. So throughout the conversation today, you'll be able to submit questions via whatever platform, Facebook or YouTube, that you are watching this on. And I'm really keen to feature as many conversations as we can from you, so I encourage you to submit questions between now and 1 p.m. Alongside this, we'll also be asking you 5 quick questions today to gauge your opinions on important topics that we are discussing. To answer them, go to menti.com, that's menti.com, and use the code on the screen, which is 682179, and answer the questions there. We'll be referring to the conclusions of those short opinion polls throughout the conversation. I also want to acknowledge the local journalists and reporters who are joining us today, including representatives from The Bulletin, The Source, Central Oregon Daily, KTVZ, OPB, Bend Radio Group, Combined Communications, and KPOV. Thank you to them and you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. So what do we mean by the title of our event today, Journalism in Crisis in the Age of COVID-19? Well, it's a title which covers a myriad of potential issues, all of which predate the pandemic, but which have been accelerated by it. I want to highlight 3 of them around media economics, misinformation, and the future of journalism. So let's start by talking a little bit about media economics. We know that around about 36,000 jobs have been lost in US newsrooms during the course of the past 3 to 4 months, and around 30 or more titles have shuttered across the US. Many others are operating at reduced capacity, which means that they might be reporting fewer stories, doing smaller print runs, and so forth. And this has huge implications for original reporting and the breadth of coverage that we as news consumers have access to. Then there's misinformation and disinformation. One of the big challenges of the digital age is how do we discern fact from fiction online? This is a challenge not just for journalists, but for audiences too. How do we know what to trust and believe, especially as it relates to COVID-19, health advice, and also some of the protests that we've seen against police brutality over the course of the past couple of weeks? There's really important questions here about the role of the media, platforms, and public officials. And lastly, what to the future of journalism? Many of the jobs that I've talked about that we have lost to COVID-19 are unlikely to come back. We know that trust in news media and journalists was already an issue. And we also know and have known for some time that newsrooms need to be more representative of the audiences and the communities that they represent. We need to tell stories differently using new tools and techniques and sources and perspectives to be able to tell journalism in fresh and engaging ways. We also have to find ways of distributing news and content to where you are. So thinking about different platforms and distribution mechanisms to make the news as accessible and informative as it possibly can be. To explore these important issues and others, I'm delighted that today we're joined by two global experts, Claire Wardle and Ivan Oransky, who kindly joined us. Claire Wardle is the Executive Director of First Draft, a nonprofit dedicated to educating journalists about reporting in an age of information disorder. Previously, she was a research fellow at the Schornstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, research director at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, head of social media for the UN Refugee Agency, and director of news services for Storyful. Dr. Wardle holds a PhD in communication and a master's degree in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. Ivan Oransky is a doctor turned reporter and a national leader among healthcare journalists. He's vice president of editorial at Medscape and distinguished writer in residence at New York University's Carter Journalism Institute, where he teaches medical journalism in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. He's also co-founder of Retraction Watch, an organization that monitors the scientific process, and president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Thank you, Claire and Ivan, for joining us today. So before we dive into questions, we wanted to create an opportunity to hear some opening remarks from each of our experts panelists, which will really help set the tone for some of the issues and topics that we're going to explore. And we flipped a digital coin earlier and Ivan won that. So he's going to kick off and then we'll hear from Claire.
Great. Thanks very much, Damian. Really a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with all of you today. And I look forward to the conversation. I think that my take on what's happening now and what we're all living through, because we're very much all part of this. This is not reporters and journalists sort of talking at people. It hasn't been for a long time, but it certainly isn't now. I'm sitting here, of course, in my home because we are all certainly here in Massachusetts still basically under stay-at-home orders. Reporting is very limited, of course, in terms of in-person reporting, although there's plenty of reporting happening, plenty of journalism happening. But what I've seen is a sort of acceleration of many trends, and I think this speaks very much to what Damian was talking about in terms of some really, what I think of as terrible numbers in terms of lost positions, lost jobs in journalism, my industry, as well as lost titles and what have you, and just less great journalism, less journalism writ large. And so there's that kind of acceleration, but there's also just an acceleration in terms of the speed of science and the speed of publication in science, which has had a real effect on how science is being reported. So many of you probably had never heard of, and you still may not have heard of, but many of you may have, something called preprint servers, which are where scientists essentially put the, if you will, the first drafts of their work online. It's really not seen by anyone before it's posted, except by the researchers themselves. And these have been around for a while, but they haven't really focused. The two that are best known in terms of sort of life sciences and clinical medicine were not around before this. It's not true to say they're not around before this pandemic, but if you look at the last sort of major outbreak, Ebola, which obviously was not as large as this one, they didn't exist then. And so the fact that researchers who are now, again, trying their best to get information out there, to do research quickly, really rushing to publication, they have these venues. And that's why, by the end of May, there were something like 47,000 papers published on novel coronavirus. That's a huge number. It's many, many times how many you would expect on a particular condition, even in a few months. And so what we're seeing here is an overwhelm of the system. And that's true, of course, in public health. It's true in journalism, but it's true in science, and that's spilling over to what we're seeing. And so the real problem is when you have this overwhelm and you have lots of reporters who have not been reporting on science or health before or medicine before. I mean, I'm a trained doctor and I don't practice, but I've reported on really nothing but science and medicine for 20 years. I like to think I know how to read a study and report on a study, but the same way I wouldn't know how to report on, Congress or the Oregon State House if you just drop me into it in the middle of some major event. I wouldn't expect a State House reporter to suddenly know how to report on clinical trials and the sort of huge story that we're still in the midst of. And so I think it's really important for all of us, journalists, readers, viewers, media consumers, to not focus on any particular story all that much. And I don't mean that these stories are bad or they're problematic, but they are, by definition, they are not the complete story. And it's not that we can wait. I mean, we're humans. I want a vaccine. I want all sorts of treatments, and I want to know more about this disease like we all do. I want to get out of my house, frankly. But we can't sort of let that rush overwhelm our, I don't want to say common sense, that's not fair, but our sort of sense that you have to trust but verify. And so any particular story that's about, say, a particular single study, that's going to be problematic. Just sort of ripped from the headlines, there was a pretty big study, including a Nobel Prize winner in a big journal that came out just last week about sort of spread of the disease. That's obviously oversimplified. BuzzFeed's already reported on this, but a number of leading researchers, epidemiologists, have just called for that study to be retracted. It's already making the news. And this just doesn't happen it doesn't happen that quickly usually. And here it is happening literally in the hours before this panel today, before this webinar. So this is happening every day. And again, it's an acceleration of what we've already seen, but I know it's hard to sort of take a deep breath and think through things, but unfortunately that's still what we have to do. And hopefully that will serve us well after the pandemic or after whatever normal becomes. And we can all become, I hope, better consumers, better reporters, and better news consumers once that's over. But we're still in the middle of it, so we're figuring it out.
That's great. Thank you, Ivan. We'll all take a deep breath and then and hear some opening remarks from Claire.
Thank you so much, Damian, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. And like Ivan, I hope we have a really intense conversation because these topics are affecting everybody. And I have to say, I've been studying this subject for the last 10 years, and I've never had a moment that whoever I talk to, somebody's got an opinion about how do we make our way through our current information ecosystem. So I lead a nonprofit called First Draft, and I lead a team of 10 journalists who every day are monitoring for misinformation. And we were funded in 2020 to just look for misinformation in the lead up to the election. So we thought we had a big, job on our hands. But as you can imagine, the last 6 months have looked very differently. So in January, one of my team members, who was actually from mainland China and speaks Mandarin, was saying, Claire, I'm seeing some stuff on WeChat about this coronavirus. And that kind of kicked off our year. And so we have been monitoring coronavirus misinformation for a number of months now, since mid-January. And I have to say, again, I've been studying this kind of material for the last 10 years, and I've never seen anything on the scale of what we've seen right now. Most of our work previously has been around elections. And so we might see a similar rumor pop up in Brazil, and then it might pop up in Nigeria later in that year when they had an election. With coronavirus, we see these rumors hopping over borders in hours. So we might see something pop up in a Dublin WhatsApp group, and then 2 hours later, we'd see the same rumor pop up in a Mexico City WhatsApp group in Spanish. I mean, we've never had a story where really the whole planet has been struggling with the same issues. And so for me, it has felt very different because of the scale, because the international nature of this. But even things like in the US, we've seen the rise of rumors circulating via text message or on Facebook Messenger or on WhatsApp Messenger in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen in the US before. This was something we'd seen in places like Brazil and India. But you may remember at the beginning of March, when we were starting to have stay-at-home orders, I will put my hand up. I'm meant to be an expert in this. There was a Sunday night in my studio apartment in the West Village where I was terrified. And somebody said to me, a text message saying, you can trust this source, saying there's going to be a lockdown in 72 hours. And I sent it to 3 people I care about in the city. And it was only 24 hours later that I realized, like everybody, when we are fearful as humans, unfortunately, our critical faculties fail us. And that's what we've seen over the last 6 months, because for many people, our lives have been turned upside down and we're seeking answers. But unfortunately, we still don't have an origin story for where this virus came from. We're still not absolutely sure about how exactly it spreads. We know more now than we did back in February. but we still can't say exactly how far those droplets travel and, what does it mean to be inside a space without ventilation. And we don't have treatment yet. There was a lot of information about hydroxychloroquine. The FDA this week changed their emergency ruling on that. But this is very hard for humans in 2020. We're used to having ridiculously clever phones and computers. We feel like we understand the world, and all of a sudden something has come along and we don't have the answers to it. And we as societies are not set up to understand that. And unfortunately, when we have vacuums or we have confusion, that's when misinformation flourishes. And so one of the big characteristics of the last 5 months has been the growth of conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories have been around for a long time. We can all make jokes about people who believe the earth is flat, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to this, we have seen conspiracies move from the fringes to the mainstream. And we've seen friends from high school, mums, aunties, people who otherwise would not necessarily be sharing this misinformation, circulating it in family WhatsApp groups, email threads, on Facebook. And so that might be about this conspiracy that 5G spreads coronavirus. It might be that Bill Gates is trying to force mandatory vaccination for population control. There's a whole host of really problematic conspiracies related to coronavirus that we're seeing at a level that we've never seen before. But rather than, if we are thinking about why it's spreading, we have to understand why we are all susceptible, and that ultimately as humans, this is a moment when we want answers. And that's where, unfortunately, when we think about science and health, we, and I say that as an academic, but also somebody who spends a lot of time in newsrooms, we have done a really bad job, I would say, of explaining how science works and how around the coronavirus, the amount of data we have is so limited. And therefore, any conclusions that we're seeing in preprint research has to be understood as a very small incremental step forward in terms of what we know. But because we're so desperate for answers, of course, our human response and the journalistic response is to grab onto these studies and to write sensational headlines about it's okay, everybody, because that's what we're all seeking. So I hope as part of this conversation, we talk about the challenge for newsrooms. How can newsrooms report on rumors without giving additional oxygen to those rumors? For a long time, journalists didn't have to worry about reporting on misinformation. Journalism is about the truth. Don't have to worry about what's false. But all the research now says that audiences actually want newsrooms to help people navigate what's true or false. But there's a real challenge. If CNN reports on a conspiracy, CNN is giving it the kind of oxygen that it otherwise wouldn't have got. So there are real challenges for journalists, but there's also challenges for us as a society. I would say that until very recently, there was this idea of like, if that guy on your Facebook newsfeed from high school was posting conspiracies, you would mute them. You would kind of ignore crazy Uncle Bob in the family email thread because, oh, it's just Bob, that's what he thinks. But actually, if we're serious about tackling this challenge that we have, which is a very seriously polluted information ecosystem, we have to talk to one another about this. But we also have to learn how to have those conversations. It's not good enough to say, hey, Bob, you're wrong, here's a Snopes article. Because what people share online is connected to their identity. And so all the research shows people actually double down when you tell them they're wrong. We have to learn about how we talk to each other in a way that is not shaming and actually says, you know what, this is really a problem for our society, for us, for our communities, for our family. Like, people are trying to divide us, people are trying to scare us. And so that's something that I'm really passionate about now, is talking with journalists, talking with community groups, talking with one another about how we tackle this, because it's not going away. And of course, we had 6 months of coronavirus in the last 3 weeks. My team have been monitoring very serious misinformation around the protests that in many ways has felt really problematic. This isn't misinformation. This is people trying to warp reality. And so when I'm now on these kind of webinars, and I don't want to be the woman who's waving her hands around, but our new normal is pretty worrying. And I really hope that we can have the kind of conversations with each other that we need to, which is, this is not frivolous anymore. People are using information to change people's perceptions of each other and society. And that's really, really problematic.
Thank you both. There's so much stuff for us to dive into and unpack there. I'm going to suggest we very quickly, I'm just going to quickly remind people the 5 questions that we're asking you on our mini poll, which is at menti.com. We'll come back to the first of those in a moment. So if you haven't had the chance to give us your opinion from the options that we're offering there, please go to menti.com and do that, and we'll come back to those in a moment. I think one of the things that's interesting from both of your remarks is the issue of speed. The speed with which both reports of scientific research is published and can be distributed, the way in which misinformation, rumors, conspiracy theories can pick up and generate enormous amounts of traction in a very, very short space of time. And so I'm really curious to sort of dive into a little bit about what that means for journalists and the skills that journalists need to have. And one of the questions we had from our audience members was specifically for you, Ivan, but asked, are journalists given any training in understanding scientific information? And a similar question to that for you, Claire, would be around, are journalists being given training as standard around managing the information that they are accessing online and managing misinformation?
Sure. So I'm president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, as I think you mentioned at the top. We're about 1,500 members, mostly here in the US, but also some international chapters and representation. And we've been around about 20 years, and really at our core, our mission is about training. So we have annual conferences. We did have to, move it this year because it was supposed to be at the end of April, beginning of May. But we have tons of ongoing training. Healthjournalism.org is our website. Tip sheets, and we have topic leaders, one of whom just does infectious diseases. I sometimes take part in workshops and what have you. I also teach journalism at New York University, and NYU is among several programs in science and health and environmental reporting. That's the name of our program is SHRP, Science, Health, Environmental Reporting Program. It's been around a bit more than 35 years now. And the idea is to take students who have some sort of background in science and then train them how to be journalists. I mean, you can sort of go the other way too and train journalists the way AHCJ does in the finer points of reading studies or, frankly, doing anything involving health, reading nonprofit hospital 990s, things like that. It's not just about studies and about findings. And so that's an important part of what we do. It's maybe the most important part of what we do. And we actually have offered for any journalist who wants to take part, sort of a, if you will, a half price, membership for 6 months, because we know that a lot of journalists are being brought on, to do this reporting, instead of whatever their normal beat is. So the answer to the question is, it's available. The training is available for journalists who can avail themselves of it. And again, we've got lots of programs like that, or if they go to school for it. Knowing enough about a lot of journalism programs around the country, a lot of them do at least offer some sort of health or science or maybe even statistics, which frankly, if I had to only do one of those courses, what I would do, I went to medical school and I had to do statistics many, many times, and I would certainly recommend that. But you do have to seek it out to some extent. It's not necessarily a core part of the curriculum. And to be fair, I didn't go to journalism school. I now teach at one, but a lot of journalists didn't go to journalism school, and so some of them may have come out of biology programs or some kind of science and be comfortable with reading studies. So it's not uniform, and there isn't sort of a journalism certificate that you have to practice journalism, which totally separate conversation. I think is a good thing because it means that there's no government regulation there. But the point is that it's nowadays I get questions from reporters, colleagues all the time. What does this mean? And I'm happy to help, of course, but I do think that some kind of statistics maybe should be definitely part of a curriculum in a journalism program, moving forward, if it isn't already.
Thank you, Ivan. That's a great point. And I speak as somebody who has a history degree, no journalism degree at all, and yet that kind of brings different skills to the table. And I think that's one of the important things about newsrooms is that we're bringing both different academic backgrounds, but also different lived experiences to our work and the way in which we see the world. And we need to do more in terms of, we'll talk about the need for greater plurality and diversity in newsrooms. But Claire, what about this point about sort of disinformation and training? And I think actually when you and I first met almost a decade ago, it was around training journalists to use this new thing called social media. And I think you said to me one time, well, in 6 months' time, I'll be out of a job because everybody will know what this means. And here we are a decade on, and there's no end in sight.
Yeah, absolutely, Damian. I actually got into this when that plane landed in the Hudson River in 2009, and the head of BBC News Gathering called me up. I was an academic at the time and said, the BBC has no idea how to verify whether that picture is real with passengers on the wing. And that was January 2009. And so it's only really been 10 years where journalists have been forced to think about how do you verify content on the social web. I mean, this became a real issue during the Arab Spring when most of the footage was coming on YouTube that was uploaded by Syrian activists, but there were no journalists on the ground. And so this new field emerged of kind of basically social verification. And so in the last 3 years, many, many more people have been concerned with how do you check out what's true when you're searching online. Unfortunately, I would say most journalism schools have still not made this part of the curriculum. This idea of like, how do you identify whether or not this is a bot network? How do you understand whether or not, to forensically analyze a video to understand, whether it has been manipulated? These are skills that journalists need. There are some programs that are starting to understand it, but it's not core. I mean, we've just started a student network. We've now got about 125 students who we're training over the summer, and many of them have said, this is so great because we're not getting it in our program. So I think to Ivan's point, unfortunately, journalists are now being required to have more skills than ever before when there are fewer resources, but yet the pressure on journalists is greater than we've ever seen. So, we have lots of free training on our website that anybody can access, but yeah, it's a new set of skills that journalists require.
So to the point around kind of the challenge of discerning what we see online and being able to understand it, this was one of the first questions that we asked on Menti. We asked the question, about to what extent people were concerned about real versus fake news on the internet. And let's see the results from that, because they're quite striking. So here we go. So here's the statement about levels of concern that what people can see on the internet. We had 63 people, I think that is. I have a lot of windows open on a very small laptop here, trying to read this. 62% of people saying they strongly agree that they are very concerned, and only 15% said that they disagree. So I think what we take away from that is that from our audience, very, very strong levels of concern about what people see and how to discern between fact and fiction, what's real versus real fake online. And of course, one of the challenges of that is around the kind of polarized media environment that we're operating in today, where you can get very, very different narratives depending on where you get your news from. And I do want to dive into that, but I also want to kind of reference the fact that one of the challenges, I think, for us as journalists is recognizing, who are the sources that we go to for information, and what are the sources that we report on. I mean, this is challenging, particularly in the current climate, when we have a White House that has been championing unproven drugs and potential procedures. I don't think it became a gate, but no one can forget Bleachgate wasn't actually that long ago. And yesterday, CNN's White House team said, and I quote from them, Trump has largely tuned out of the persistent coronavirus contagion, which is causing spikes in new cases across 21 states and daily death tolls that reach into the hundreds, to focus instead on reviving the economy and his own political prospects. So given that we are kind of getting some very different kind of narrative, arguably from public health officials to politicians, how do we navigate this, both as journalists but also as news consumers?
Who wants to take that one? Ivan, you took a breath in, so you can start.
I was going to say it's one of these things, and I when I work with my students at NYU, I teach a course sometimes that's about hope and hype, sort of different in health. I mean, it's nice because there's some alliteration there, right? But it's sort of thinking of how do you separate the hope and the hype and all of that in health reporting. And it often comes down to trying to understand where the actual claim came from. And I think maybe this is more of an answer that, and I apologize, Claire, if this is stealing your thunder a little bit, but it's really more about consuming the news. I can talk about what it means for reporters, but if someone doesn't even cite, it's not that studies are perfect. I run a site called Retraction Watch. I certainly know that many of them are, turn out to not be correct, or some turn out to even be fraudulent. But if you don't even cite a source like that, let alone, whether it's fraudulent or not, then that means I don't know whether to trust you or not. And I don't know whether to trust this claim or not. One of the really interesting things that happened that we wrote about at one point, but that NPR, Richard Harris really broke this story. This is a couple months ago now, it turned out that the testing strategy of the Trump administration had been promoting was based on a study that it had been retracted. And we actually didn't report that first. Richard Harris did, like I mentioned, NPR. And so, when he actually pressed, he said, well, what is this based on? What study, what evidence basis do you have? And they pointed to this study that turned out had been retracted. So there, again, it's sort of a secondary question, but, you have to, again, trust but verify. And as a reporter, again, if a politician makes a claim or anyone makes a claim, I mean, to Claire's point, if your Uncle Bob makes a claim, it isn't going to affect the national sort of public health. But if President Trump makes a claim, or if Anthony Fauci makes a claim, what is the basis for that? And one hopes that, I'm sort of split between New York and Massachusetts, so I pay attention to what's happening in New York. The slide decks that Governor Cuomo in New York he would sort of have on next to him, I think on either TVs on either side of him during his press conferences every day. They had information, they had data. You could actually download them afterward and check out, does this stuff check out? And it's not that people, won't make mistakes, but you can at least check it, and maybe you have to correct it or what have you. But, show your work. I mean, show where you got this information as a first point of sort of verification for reporters. And then if as a news consumer, you don't see that, I wouldn't hold it in such high regard.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that reporters have seen over the last couple of years that unfortunately misinformation is not just online. We do have politicians, and this is globally, making statements that are false. And I think the challenge in the US was, for example, what to do with a Trump press conference, because we know from the literature that even if corrections are issued, they don't travel as far as the falsehood. So I've never been one to say that we shouldn't be covering Trump's press conferences, but because we have already seen that there are moments when there are falsehoods being pushed, we actually need to have a delay, and we need to have a 5-minute delay. So on screen, there can be real-time fact checking. In the same way as Twitter now are not taking down falsehoods by Trump, but they're actually adding a flag and then context that you can read around. I mean, this is not a country that, anybody wants to support taking down speech or not covering speech. But we do have a situation that when people in real time are pushing false information, we need to be able to respond. And if, an hour later, somebody pushes out a correction to say, well, what Trump said about bleach was incorrect, unfortunately, there is already the content where that is connected. So unfortunately, I think we just need to rethink the way that we do journalism, because now we are in a situation where we do have senior officials pushing very dangerous, false and misleading information.
And do we, alongside that, also need to rethink the way we as consumers consume that information? That it can be very easy to get sucked into the 24/7 news cycle, and that actually being able to sort of take a pause, take a beat, kind of not read and react to the first thing that we see, but actually take time to reflect on information from a variety of different sources, not just the kind of play-by-play TikTok that you would see coming out of a news organization, but actually the piece that's written the next day or even a few days later, which might give a different perspective. That actually it's not just journalists that arguably need to slow down. We as news consumers do too. Would you agree with that in terms of if we're thinking about sort of tips and techniques, and we'll come back to these during the course of our conversation. For me, that's one of the first ones that I would personally advocate.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'd say is that we used to operate in a world where we had gatekeepers, and that wasn't a perfect situation, and there were certainly issues about who those gatekeepers were, but there was a sense of you knew who was giving you the information and what checks they had gone through. We now have this democratization of information, and that is a good thing. But what we also have to understand is it's a little bit like a lake in the summer that's got algae. You kind of like walk in tentatively and you're aware that, stuff that you might be swimming through isn't perfect. And I think we haven't, as a society, acknowledged that shift, which is a lot of the streams that we're now living in are actually polluted, some very, very badly, some not so much. But as consumers, unfortunately, we're having to do more work because we're not relying on gatekeepers in the same way. And I don't think we've necessarily recognized that shift.
Well, and I would also say, science has been going through this actually for some years now. Again, there's sort of been an acceleration of a lot of trends that were happening already when you look at COVID and the pandemic. So science for a number of years has been grappling with the fact that a lot of studies turn out in many fields turn out not to be, they don't hold up when you try and repeat the work or do something a little bit different. and I'm shorthanding all that, but when if you will, the sort of forces that had reason to doubt science or were sort of politically motivated in terms of questioning particular results. I'm thinking about climate change in particular. I'm thinking about, other regulatory sort of areas that overlap with regulation. They have seized upon that, and they have really sort of weaponized this sort of doubt, and in many ways taking a playbook really going back to the tobacco companies and the way that they really weaponize doubt. Like, doubt is a really good thing, actually. It's how we learn more. It's when we're skeptical and when we test and sort of wake up every morning like, how might I be wrong? And I think scientists and journalists, when they're doing their best work, that's how you wake up every morning. The problem, though, now is that playbook is out there, and it's not a problem that the playbook's out there. The problem is that there are people who, let's face it, may be bad faith actors or who have motivations that they aren't sharing or conflicts of interest they aren't sharing, and they're using it to really cast doubt on everything. And we have to, at some point, make decisions. And if we are left sort of with the impression that we don't know anything and that everything is, really in doubt as opposed to provisional, which is different, that's a really hard place for us to be as humans. I mean, it's a hard place for me to be, and that's where I am all the time. But our brains don't like that. We don't like uncertainty. And so that's something that I think is really coming to the fore now and that we have to grapple with.
So this is a good opportunity to go perhaps to the second question that we saw on Menti, where we asked people about levels of concern about misinformation around COVID-19. So again, we'll just pull up the results of that. Because I think that, and so levels of concern. So 56% of people said that they are very concerned about misinformation, and 38% said they are somewhat concerned. So that's what 84% of people have some level of concern around misinformation here. And I think this feeds into one of the questions that one of the audience members asked us, which was around how mainstream media has become increasingly about opinion, perhaps rather than news, and how difficult it can be to discern between the two. What are your thoughts on that? So again, I'm throwing in these huge philosophical questions and no one wants to.
No. I mean, I think this goes back to, social feeds flattened all information and took out the heuristic. So when our human brains are overloaded, we're desperately looking for these kind of shortcuts, mental shortcuts that help us make sense and, understand whether or not something is credible. But on Facebook, everything looks the same. And that's the case even for opinion and facts. So if I'm opening a newspaper, I've been trained to understand that the first 20 pages are hard news, and then it sort of moves into opinion and op-eds, and then there's some cartoons and sport at the back. Like, you're kind of trained in that way. But then the internet arrived, and we actually did a terrible job when we moved news online. We didn't recreate those heuristics clearly enough up top, even just as a URL, let alone in Facebook. So people were really confused, like, well, the Washington Post is anti-Trump. Well, no, you're reading some anti-Trump op-eds, but that's distinct from the Washington Post. And of course, the bigger issue about CNN and MSNBC is the economics of this is it's much cheaper to have 4 people shouting at each other about their opinions than it is to actually pay reporters to get out onto the field and to actually do reporting. So unfortunately, the whole landscape has shifted, and we did a really terrible job of explaining what that was. And as a result, we've seen trust in media decline in really serious ways. And we're now scrabbling, but I worry that maybe it's a bit late. I don't know if Ivan has other thoughts, but.
Ivan, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I would just agree with what Claire's saying. I mean, the demarcation it's been sort of eroding for a long time. I think that we, again, when all you see is a headline, unless it's sort of a first person, I think X, then you don't know what you're clicking onto. And to some extent, maybe to be a little devil's advocate about it, it sort of doesn't matter as long as the opinion is sort of evidence-based. In other words, there's a famous, what was it, Tip O'Neill, and it's probably not Tip O'Neill, I'm probably getting that wrong, but the famous quote about, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. But that requires a level of verification, and it requires a level of sophistication about what you're reading that, exactly to Claire's point, that I think we're losing a bit of. The other argument, and not argument, the other sort of, I think, coming to terms that journalism is having, and this is more, I think, in terms of what's going on in current events, I think this is really more about the protests that are happening now than it is about COVID and the pandemic, although it's somewhat related, is, well, wait, shouldn't journalists be really advocating for justice? And certainly in my training and in my thinking about my role as a journalist, the only kinds of advocacy positions that I was ever, trained or sort of led to be comfortable with are very minimal. So sort of like transparency, freedom of information, very core values that really had nothing to do with who was saying it or what the position was. Now, some journalists are saying, you know what, that's not really, that's not consistent with what journalism is trying to be and the role that journalists should have. And I have to say, and I think it's an active discussion. I think that there are, people who feel very strongly about both of those positions. It used to be if you worked at the Washington Post, you were, I don't want to get this wrong, but sort of like you didn't talk about voting or you were even discouraged from voting. I mean, Len Downey used to say, I don't vote. That's one side, if you will, of the spectrum. Then there's the other side that says, look, I'm going to be fair, I'm going to be objective, but I'm not going to just sort of be right down the middle and do the he said, she said thing, which is a problem, by the way, the sort of he said, she said journalism that we're getting, whether it's the panels, whether it's, you have to quote someone who, doesn't believe in climate change as opposed to someone who does, and somehow that's balanced, even though it's a fringe position. So I think that that's all part of the mix here. And, look, like everyone else, journalists are grappling with these, they're really existential issues. I mean, who are we, what do we do, and what are our values? We haven't figured it out yet.
No, and it feels like we're having this conversation at a really interesting tipping point where a lot of those values are very much open to question. There's a lot of legitimate discussion about whether the journalism of the future is and should be like the journalism of the past. I know that, for example, if I talk to my students, they say, if I have to choose between being an advocate or a journalist, I'm going to become an advocate. And that therefore the kind of outlets that they are looking for are places that are not necessarily kind of neutral news organizations, but ones that have a kind of clear agenda for the type of society that they want to help contribute to and report on. Now, one of the questions we had from our audience was around this kind of second T question. So we've talked about Trump. We need to talk a little bit about trust. So one person says, what is the role of journalists in rebuilding trust? How do we do that? I have friends in Bend who won't consume any media because they don't trust them. So what are some of the things that journalists should be doing to rebuild trust? We've touched on a few of these things, but it would be great to kind of reiterate that and perhaps expand some of the ideas that we're discussing.
So, I mean, I think Ivan did a great job of explaining the scientific process, but I think I started with my remarks to say that I think both the journalism industry and science, we've done a terrible job of explaining how the sausage is made. And journalists have assumed that people understood the processes, the guidelines, the rigor that goes into journalism. Unfortunately, not all journalism is perfect all of the time. And so what that means is people will hold up a bad headline or hold up a mistake that then correction has to be issued. Journalism works, but we failed to do that. And I think, and going back to what journalism looks like, of course, I have the same accent as you, Damian. We're from a country that television in the UK is regulated and television is absolutely neutral, but our newspapers are not. And our newspapers, you absolutely know whether it's left or right. And so it always feels strange here where newspapers are one thing, but then I turn on the television and I have a real problem when I see all of that difference. So journalism can be different things to different people, but the trust question, I think, absolutely, we have failed to explain that process and how seriously journalism ethics is taken by those people who are journalists, how hard journalists work, how little they get paid. There's a reason people feel that they're drawn to being a journalist and there's a higher calling, but we've completely failed to do that. I mean, there are other things such as newsrooms I don't think have been truly representative of their communities. in many cases, and therefore have not told certain stories, not necessarily out of spite, but are just being completely unaware that it was a story in their community. So that's an issue. I think there's been that sense of I'm the gatekeeper, trust me, and there's been a failure to explain the reporting process. I think the best examples of when people are, releasing their transcripts to show where that came from, linking directly to the data or the study so people can do their own checks, responding to comments on a story when somebody says, well, actually, I think you've missed that. And the journalist goes into the comments and says, thanks so much. I will update that based on your, all of those things are best practices. How you do that when your journalism has been ripped of its resources, how a journalist does that when they're already working 14-hour days, that's the challenge. And I think the connection between the rise of misinformation and the rise in local news deserts is real. It's a correlation. Causation is harder to demonstrate, but I think we have to recognize that the absence of quality reporting in many parts of the US has provided space for misinformation to flourish. So it's a crucial part of this question. And if we're going to rebuild trust, we need more resources, and we need resources to be poured into local journalism. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think COVID is starting to kind of press the red button to say, we've had journalism conferences for 5 years about this emergency, but now there needs to be action.
And it feels as if some things ideas are on the table, such as, for example, public funding for journalism is now a conversation we're having in the US, whereas in Europe, that's a much more comfortable conversation to have. A couple of years ago, if you talked to both members of the public and indeed editors and publishers, there'd be a lot of discomfort about that. But now, because of the situation we're in, because of the crisis that we're in, suddenly it's opened the door to a recognition of, well, if we don't potentially pursue some of these avenues, then the journalism we end up with the other side of this could be pretty dire and catastrophic and sparse.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although even just looking in the last couple of days, when the head of the agency in charge of Voice of America was, and another sort of related U.S. media efforts, sort of government-backed U.S. media efforts, has become so politicized. I suppose everything always is politicized. Again, I'm not naive about that. So it's an interesting time for all of that. I have my own feelings about that. I think that lots of different kinds of models. I obviously, in my regular job at Medscape, we're a trade news organization, very typical trade model in terms of advertising and what have you. I also run, as you mentioned, Retraction Watch, which is nonprofit. We're also tiny. It's a totally different way of thinking about things. So I sort of think about both of those and other models as well. And I think that, to me, in terms of trust, one of the problems that we have, and again, COVID is just exacerbating this, is this sort of whiplash. And again, back to this sort of single study idea, in normal time, if you will, quote unquote, normal times, okay, so 1 week coffee kills you, and the next week coffee saves you, and the following week red wine and chocolate. I don't know, you can do a sort of almost Mad Libs of, for those of you who remember what Mad Libs are, of, sort of what does it do and what is it related to? And these are all, of course, observational studies. It's, I think Claire said, correlation and not causation just now. But, that is the diet of health and mostly health, some science journalism that we've somehow gotten to, again, partly because of the economics and because of other factors. And so, but it never really mattered that much. I don't want to be light of it because I think it's terrible. But I think that what it did in terms of a day-to-day, who cares whether chocolate, is good for you or bad for you? If you like chocolate, eat it. And if there are reasons you shouldn't eat it, then don't eat it. But, same with red wine and coffee. But now, if someone 1 week says masks are going to definitely protect you and prevent spread, and the following week you get, this one says that it's going to make it worse, that's going to actually kill people, with not to be too blunt, but in a way that our previous sort of strategy, our previous patterns set us up for, but weren't going to kill us by themselves. That's really problematic. And I think in order to get the trust back, we need to stop with the whiplash. One thing we need to do.
So just picking up on both that whiplash and one of the comments Claire made about sort of process, we had a question from one of the members of the audience who asked about headlines. And I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of people might just read a headline and then they think from that they have an understanding of a story. We also see there's plenty of data that shows that the sheer volume of material that is shared on social media when people haven't read a story, they've just seen the headline and then they share it. So it's interesting that we're starting to see efforts to reduce that, whereby you won't be able to share a story if you haven't actually read it. There was a very specific question around, can you address how headlines are chosen? What is the process by which a headline is created and the way in which a story is summarized? Given how important that is, that for some people, that's all they will see and that's all that will stick with them.
Yeah,
I mean, one of the things.
You start.
Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead. One of the things that I always, and this is actually, Claire, you were talking about the difference between the, UK media and US. So again, the terms are different. I won't bore people with all the terminology, but in the UK, my understanding is it's basically the only people who write headlines are what are known as the sub-editors. In other words, what we call copy editors. That's not exactly parallel, but essentially parallel. And so, whereas here it's a bit different, but even in the UK, when I've talked to folks who work in those newsrooms, if a reporter and an editor working together write a headline, at least to draft a headline, if they know how many characters it needs to be and everything else, an editor who's in charge of the headlines will almost never sort of just reject it out of hand, as long as it fits certain criteria, and reporters should know what those are. I used to run Reuters Health, which is the health unit at Reuters, of course, and we had very strict, if I'm remembering right, it was like 51 characters with spaces. That was it. My reporters learned how to write those so that I didn't have to write it, and it reflected what was in the story. Nowadays, and that was basically 10 years ago I was there, and things were starting to happen in terms of what I'm about to talk about. But the need for search engine optimization, right? This SEO, which everyone talks about, the need for keywords, the need, frankly, for putting outrage into headlines so that people will click on it more. Again, I don't want to sort of pass the buck, but it basically is a requirement. It's sort of or at least a completely predictable outcome of the economics, where you're always fighting for eyeballs, you're always competing for eyeballs. But I think when journalists are being honest, which I hope that they are most of the time or all the time, they talk amongst themselves about the need for putting things into headlines or keeping things out of headlines that end up sometimes being misleading in the service of getting people to click. And going back to what you were saying, Damian, that's actually, I mean, the way that you can sleep at night a little bit about that is say, well, you're just getting people to click on a really good story that they should read. But given the data we know about a lot of people not even reading the whole story, that's actually even more problematic. So I think, again, to Claire's point about how the sausage is made, we should be open about that and we should talk about it. And sometimes there are comments on a lot of outlets that I've worked where it says, this is a clickbait headline. Actually, good story, but total clickbait headline. It's not even about that. So I think we need to be honest about that.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, we do a lot of training at First Draft, and often in our training, by the end, the journalist will say, great training, Claire, but you should actually have my editors in here because I agree with everything you're saying, but I've got like 10x page view targets for this month. And if I don't hit it, then we're going to lose staff. And unfortunately, headlines are what drives traffic. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is we live in a world now where people think about headlines to sell front page papers that are old school on a rack, and there's headlines that people might find if they search on Google, and then there's ways to get people to click on Twitter and Facebook when people are kind of stumbling through, and all of those are different. But one thing I would say, in an age where people are less likely to read, it makes design a lot more important. And so I'd say the flatten the curve diagram, I hope one day wins a Pulitzer Prize, because in many ways that diagram did everything we needed it to do, which was to explain a pretty complex concept in something that could be shared in a text message without having anybody had to click on a link. And so, I talk a lot to health professionals. And so, for example, I talk to, the WHO, and I talk about the anti-vax problem. I'm like, the anti-vax community are excellent at creating outrage memes that go viral on Facebook. You guys create 87-page PDFs with a picture of a dripping needle on the front cover. Like, that's not going to work. And so we actually need to put better designers in newsrooms, better designers in health authorities and governments, because unfortunately people now have got, they don't read as much. They are more likely to share without clicking. And so how do we bring design into this space and explain complexity through design? So I think that will be the new, freshman class in journalism school, I think, in the next few years.
Great. I'm conscious we have only a couple of minutes left, and I have a couple of quick topics that I want to touch on. So I'm going to very quickly go to one of the Menti questions that we had around the role of trust in local media organizations. So I'm curious to see what our audience said in terms of the level of trust that they have in local media. As we know, we have a number of representatives from those organizations with us today.
So very quickly, I'll just say we study disinformation, and we know that so-called bad actors, they use local newsrooms logos. They pretend to be local newsrooms because local newsrooms still have high levels of trust with their community. So the fact that they are targeting shows that they understand that you are so critical to your community. So you do have trust, but it also makes you vulnerable.
Great. And so our poll kind of reinforces that to some extent, in that we found that, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being complete trust amongst our audience, we averaged out at 7.4 in terms of the kind of trust barometer for local news and local journalism. So, we know that it's a very challenging time to be a local journalist, but I'd be curious from both of your perspectives, what is the role of local journalism in terms of covering a pandemic and supporting communities? What are local journalists doing well? What would you like to see them perhaps doing better or doing more of?
Well, I think it's critical, and again, at AHCJ, Association of Healthcare Journalists, we have members in local newsrooms all around the country, not all around the world, but mostly around the US. They're doing the really important work, because national news outlets are also really critical, don't get me wrong, but yet another story about a particular study or about a particular finding, I don't think we need many more of those. What we really need is to understand what's happening on the ground. I mentioned I spend time in New York and also here in Western Massachusetts, and I subscribe to our local newspaper, and they're doing great work. We are very close to what was a really bad outbreak and a number of deaths at a soldier's home in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and that story just came out drips and drabs because of the reporting of the local press. You're not going to have that level of scrutiny if you completely, abandon the local press, which unfortunately their business model is really hurting. So I think they can, if by focusing on the local stories, because that's their outlet, that's their home, I think that's where they can really make a big difference.
And just quickly, I'd just say, this is very much almost city by city differences in terms of, what phase different areas are at. And so if people are just watching CNN and NBC, they're completely missing what's actually happening in a particular city. And I think that's what we've missed too, which was we've kind of told the coronavirus in the US. As a European, it's a little bit saying people in Moscow, it's the same as the people in London, people in Oregon, the people in New York. And I think that's why local news is so important. So people can say, what's happening right now in my town? What do I need to know? And that's why local journalism is absolutely critical right now, always, but particularly right now.
And we've talked a lot about the challenges that journalists are facing. I mean, one of the comments on YouTube, someone has said, journalists, there's so much that's expected of journalists, and they're doing that for not great salaries, and also doing that in very kind of politicized environment, of course, as well now.
They're being attacked. They're being attacked on the streets. I mean, that's the other, we haven't really discussed that. I mean, the last 3 weeks have been a terrible 3 weeks for journalism in the US.
Yes, and unfortunately, we don't really have time to dive into that now, which is a shame. But we'll have to do another event at another point to kind of talk about that. But I'm conscious we've talked a lot about what journalists need to do differently, and then a little bit about what we as consumers need to do. And I'd love to kind of sort of end on that, really, to sort of think about what are the things that we as news consumers perhaps need to do differently, either in terms of our news habits, but also something you talked about, Claire, in your opening remarks, in terms of the conversations we also need to have with our friends and family. We shouldn't just put all of the responsibility for navigating information around really important public health issues and conspiracy theories onto platforms and journalists. I believe we have to take some ownership of that as well. So if that's the case, what should we be doing?
I'll let Ivan go in.
No, I was going to say, I'll just say briefly, I mean, at the risk of sounding self-serving, although I don't work for a local media outlet support your local media outlets. Subscribe. Some of them are running donation, campaigns and things. We need that. Their advertising has fallen away. We really need that even more now than ever. So please do that. And also, I guess just to, trust but verify. Anything you read. Again, I know I sound like a broken record, but we really need to trust but verify, and that's particularly true if you're sharing it on social media or something else. Do you actually have a reason to believe what you're reading? Is what I would suggest.
Yeah, and I just end by saying that as human beings, when we have an emotional reaction to information, it's when our brain fails us. So if you read something, it doesn't matter if it's in a newspaper or if it's online, but if it makes you scared, if it makes you angry, if it makes you want to go and buy something because you think that's going to be a reaction. Like if you have a visceral reaction to something, that's when you need to say, hang on, I need to give my brain time to reflect on this. And it's the same for me if I eat 6 cookies. It takes a good 20 minutes for my brain to say, Clay, you do not need another cookie. And unfortunately, we have to train our brains when it comes to information to say when we are scared, we are incapable of using all of those critical faculties. And so we need to be better at recognizing when we have those reactions to information. And that's the kind of conversations we should be having with each other around the dinner table, because right now, if we weren't all sharing misinformation, we wouldn't have a problem. And I think that's, we all talk about Russia. It's actually us. We're the ones who are circulating so much of this stuff. And if we slow down, then we wouldn't be in quite the situation that we're in right now.
So, well, that's a great point on which to end our conversation today. I know that we have only scratched the surface of this incredibly complex topic, and there's a whole number of issues that we have not had time to dive into today. But this has been a great conversation, and my thanks to our expert panel, Claire Wardle and Ivan Oransky, for joining us today, and to everyone at City Club of Central Oregon who's made today's event possible, and of course, most especially to you, our audience, for joining us and for asking all of your great questions. You can still submit questions via YouTube and Facebook, and we'll try and come back to as many of those offline as we can. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you thought it was valuable and you got some great tips and advice from it, remember it will be available to watch on catch up, so pass it on to your friends and family. I'll now hand you back to Christine Coffin for a few final remarks. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you to today's speakers, Damian, Claire, and Ivan, for taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in today's program. Our next live stream is Racial Injustice and the Tools of Civility, a Central Oregon perspective. During this live stream, Erica McAlpin and Zach Boone, co-chairs of the City Club Civility Project, will facilitate a conversation with 2 Black men, Marcus LeGrand and Rob Garreau, about their personal experiences living in Central Oregon, especially during these times of racial unrest. In addition, we'll speak to Police Chief Jim Porter to learn what the Bend Police Department is doing to ensure the department's encounters with Black and Indigenous people of color in Central Oregon are safe. Please watch on Thursday, July 2nd at noon on our Facebook page or YouTube channel.